My name's Sue Davis, and I live here in Floyd. I also lived here in Floyd, I won't say how many years ago, but a long time ago, in excess of 30 years ago. And then I left, and then I came back. So I've been in Floyd about 4 years now. And I was asked to talk with you about quilts because, as you can see, when I was here before, I did my thesis on quilting in Appalachian quilting in Floyd County. So I have a little background information for that. But before we talk specifically about quilts, I wanted to think about what are quilts. And quilts are made from fabrics. And I think fabrics kind of get overlooked in a lot of situations. Humans have co-evolved with fabric from the moment that we get swaddled at birth. We're surrounded by textiles. Try to imagine what a world would be like without them. We'd have nothing covering our bodies, of course, no plush mattresses or downy coverings that we're going to sleep with, no rugs or carpets under our feet, no seat belts, sofa cushions, tents, bath towels, medical masks, and the ubiquitous duct tape. We have textile references embedded in our language. What is it that you take to get from the parking lot to the airport? A shuttle. Do you know what a shuttle is, besides that vehicle? What do you say when you constantly change lanes on a crowded roadway? You weave in and out of traffic. What about those conversation threads that we follow on the internet? So it's definitely a big part of our lives. Fabrics are so woven into our lives that we take them for granted. We are largely oblivious and rarely, if ever, think about the ingenuity, not to mention the knowledge and effort that's embodied in every single scrap of cloth. You know, ancient peoples crossed continents for textiles. The textile trade funded empires, the Italian Renaissance. Textile products gave rise to financial institutions, as well as to the slave trade. If I quote from The Fabric of Civilization, a book that was written by Virginia Pastoral, she says, in ways both subtle and obvious, beautiful and terrible, textiles have made our world. But back to quilts. Because quilts are textiles and quilts are part of our world. I've long believed that quilts in the early settlement of America, crafted primarily by female hands, are a valuable tool for uncovering the everyday lives and experiences of women. For the most part, women have been called spectacular casualties of traditional history. And it is only in recent decades that simple utilitarian quilts have begun to take their place as a voice for daily domestic work done by women. The quilt, defined as padding, encased in 2 layers of cloth, held in place by stitching, a cloth sandwich as it were, existed long before the European settlers arrived in the New World. An ivory carving found in 1903 depicts the king of Egypt in 3400 BC wearing what appears to be a quilted cloak. By the colonial period, people everywhere in the world were using some kind of padded fabric. With the arrival of the English and Dutch settlers in North America, quilting began to take on a new aspect and flourish. This is a little technical stuff here if you're not that familiar with quilts. There's basically 3 types of quilts. You have a whole cloth quilt, applique quilt, and pieced or patchwork quilt. Europeans, during the colonial period, tended to favor the whole cloth quilts, or counterpanes as they were sometimes called. It was a single fabric front and a single back, and then the decoration was padded or corded elaborately. The applique quilt is also made from a single cloth front and back, but has colorful smaller pieces stitched in elaborate designs, and often it has a central applique, or what's called a medallion. This was a favored quilt and was very much in vogue from 1750 to 1850. However, it required expensive imported fabric and vast amounts of leisure time. The early patchwork quilt, as we know it here in America, is a strictly utilitarian article, born of the necessity to have warm bedding. Thus, we have very little record of these earliest patchwork quilts because they were utilitarian. They were used, and fabric self-destructs after a certain period. They were often designed also to be made quickly and used scraps of all sizes. There were textiles coming to the colonies. The British East India Company brought them to America. That was not a problem. The cost was a problem. But England had banned the sale of desirable calicos or cotton prints from India in order to protect their local wool and linen industries. So the British East India Company ships would pick up their loads and they'd bring them here because we didn't have those same laws in the colonies. In fact, calicos from India were so desirable that in France, for 73 years, they treated calico like the U.S. treats cocaine today. In the mountains of Southwest Virginia, goods had to be carried from the lower elevation, were expensive, and they were not plentiful. Fabric was most likely not a priority when women could spin fiber and weave cloth themselves. Granted, the process was lengthy. I mean, if you've looked downstairs at how it starts out to get to a fabric, you know how lengthy. Floyd was geographically isolated, and the lack of rail service meant that industry could not develop to the extent of neighboring counties. By 1860, Floyd had 10 manufacturing establishments, employing 18 men, compared to Montgomery County's 45 manufacturing establishments. The rough terrain that led to the isolation also meant that people of Floyd maintained their mountain crafts much longer than in other parts of the country. For the rest of the world, the Industrial Revolution ushered in changes, but in Floyd, changes came slowly. Floyd quilts remained as bedclothes, and although women strived to impart beauty and creativity, they maintained their utilitarian purpose well into the 20th century. Those early settlers could not afford to simply discard things when they wore out. Necessity requires that they use their resources carefully. Therefore, if they had a blanket, when the blanket became worn, it was patched. Then it became worn, and they combined it with other hatched pieces of blanket and may have used it as a filler or a batting within a quilt eventually. The better parts of worn clothing were saved along with scraps when new clothing was constructed. The cotton sacks that sugar and flour and salt came in were carefully bleached. The stitches were taken apart. One quilter that I talked to told me a story about keeping all her uncle's little RJR tobacco bags and taking those all apart and bleaching them and using them in a quilt top. In the 1920s, the manufacturers of flour, animal feed, and like products realized that frugal women were bleaching out the advertising messages and using their sacks for different products, clothing and quilts, for example. The hog and chicken feed sacks were about 37 inches by 43 inches, and 4 of them sewn together would make the lining of a quilt. The manufacturers thought it made good business sense to actually print the sacks with cute designs. They first printed them in solid colors, and then they realized, oh, well, we need to do little prints on the fabric. And so in 1925, they went to prints. By the late 30s, the manufacturers were competing to produce the most desirable prints, and I think there were about 8 of them in the country at the time. Women did buy more feed and traded sacks among friends to have more like sacks. This lasted through World War II, when women were once again encouraged to conserve. Many quilters in Floyd remembered first quilting at a young age. They recalled mothers having women over to quilt and socialize, the quilting bee, what we call it. I don't know that it was called a bee in Floyd specifically, but it's come to be known by that. Often children were not tall enough to sit and reach the quilt. If you've seen the quilt group out back quilting, you know, you can't really sit in a chair and reach the quilt if you're a young child. So they remember having to stand on the corner and quilt on the corner, and probably those stitches were taken out because they weren't adequate. But young women were taught discipline and forced to sit and complete a job that they had started. They learned to thread a needle. They learned to refine their stitches. They learned patience, and they learned to work with others. Later, they would make quilts for their future families, and once they were engaged, for their marital bed. Now, this story I'm going to tell you is not specifically Floyd, but it's a story about Eli Merkley, a farmer who was married in 1850. He and his wife had 12 children. 9 of them were female. Now, as the daughters grew, they made quilt tops, and many were put away to finish up at a later date. As it turned out, sadly, only one girl married, and the remaining boys died early in life. When the youngest daughter died in 1974 at the age of 98, a niece found 115 quilts neatly folded in blanket boxes in the attic. So this kind of tells you the importance of having quilts. When a woman entered into marriage, she needed to bring something to the household and something for her family. Now, you would think that to do this number of quilts, the Merkley girls had nothing more to do except make quilts. But Eli was a farmer, as were most of the people who settled Floyd. Still today, most residents farm, and may have another job. Maybe they commute during the day, but they still got the farm. Their lives were full. They had to tend gardens, preserve food, take care of animals, wash clothes, and older children were expected to help care for the younger ones, certainly in families of 10 to 12 children. Without our modern conveniences, it takes a lot to just live. Every time they needed warm water, they had to have a fire. They needed a fire to cook, to keep warm, to do laundry. Just think of the added time when you can't just walk into your bathroom and turn on the shower. Quilts were sandwiched in because they were necessary. It's easy to understand how artistic inclinations crept into these purely functional objects as young women dreamed of a future, or older women remembered the past. As they gazed out over the fields, how the freshly tilled soil became a log cabin straight furrow, quilt, or how a glimpse of color made grandmother's flower garden. Maybe the colors didn't all match, and the stitches were not small and neat, but these ragbag and everyday quilts show more ingenuity of planning and more daring color combinations and are bolder than those of the time that were made from store-bought fabric. Perhaps while she sat snapping beans for the Piccadilly, she was planning that quilt in her mind, a unique quilt that tells her story. One quilter has said, "You can't always change things. Sometimes you don't have control over the way things go. Hail ruins crops or fire burns you out. And then you're just given so much to work with in a life, and you have to do the best you can with what you've got." A patchwork quilt is like that. You use what you've got to create the best you can. Now, my research for my thesis was interviewing 22 quilters in Floyd, and I say elderly with trepidation since most of them were at least I'm probably older than some of them, but so when I went to their homes and I interviewed them on tape, and then the tapes were transcribed. And if you want to know any more about this study, the thesis is at the Jesse Peterman Library, as well as I'm going to take the transcriptions from the interviews down as well. So you can look into that in the, I don't know what they call that room, their historic room. Anyway, so so these are just, I'll just kind of show these to you, run through. This is a 9-patch, and this kind of quilt was one that often young girls would start with because it's just the blocks, the simple blocks. Women, when I did my interviews back in the latter part of the 70s, were all hand quilting quilts. It was like almost unheard of to try and do it on a sewing machine. Today, these quilters out here are like, oh my gosh, can you imagine people actually hand quilting these things? So. This is another form of 9 diamond, but she's kind of done 9 diamonds within 9 diamonds. So it's a little more complicated. This is 1900 quilt. And you'll notice on these older quilts that they are quilted in diagonals or what's called the fan pattern. And there's some quilts coming up I can show you the fan pattern. But it's like when you're sitting at a quilting frame and quilting, the fan pattern was very easy because you could just kind of quilt a curve and then you go up a couple inches and quilt another curve and so forth. And so it's a series of quilted fans, as it were. This is block album around 1890. And you'll notice as we go through these that you start to get a feel for the types of fabrics that were available. And you can use that to date quilts nowadays. You can get reference books that tell what kinds of fabrics came out at what date, and you can compare that. Here you can see, I think there's a close-up, the fan patterns of the quilting. Here, and then there's parts of fans there as well. Now, you'll notice on these quilts that a lot of them come out of the rag bag. I mean, it's whatever came out, that's what was used in the quilt. Also, we have a lot of quilts that have scraps of shirts from Shirt Factory. And I think when I did my interviews, there was kind of a resurgence of quilting back in the 70s, you know, and people started paying attention to more to quilting. But everyone was taken by these ultra fine stitches and these beautiful combinations of fabrics that largely came from cities, you know, from the larger cities, and where there were wealthy women who had time to do nothing but quilt. They probably had people cleaning their houses for them and cooking their food for them. So a lot of that was because of the free time, and that's what people appreciated. These quilts from the same period were often overlooked. These are the utilitarian quilts. These are the quilts that were made for families to sleep under. And I think it's only today that we look at these quilts and we see the beauty in the randomness of the pattern. And I think that in itself is due to the passage of years in that time from the late 70s, 80s to today. Here's another one. This one is hanging in the gallery downstairs. But it's a very complicated pattern of stars and squares, but it's all completely done with random fabrics. And if you get a chance to go down and look at this, it's at the end of the room by the back door. I think it's worth seeing the entire pattern. A pinwheel quilt from 1948. Here's another type of windmill, pinwheel, from an earlier period, 1900. Pattern called monkey wrench. Often patterns for a quilt may have several names depending on what part of the country they were from. This is 1900 quilt. You have to remember what was going on in the world too. The fact that in 1900, that was the Victorian time. We had a lot of excess, and that maybe this pink might not have been so out of character in that period. Pink and black. And it was quilted with black thread and black backing. And I was told by the quilter it was so that it wouldn't show soil. Another style of monkey wrench. A basket quilt. This one clearly shows the fan pattern. 1927. Another basket quilt. 1910. Now, this is a save-all quilt, and when I was doing my interviews, I heard people talk about save-all. And today I have, in literature that I have looked at between now and then, I never see this term. And I've asked people, have you ever heard of save-all? But the people that I interviewed, I mean, it's perfectly descriptive. And I think it's a great term, but I have never seen it anywhere. So I would say that that's probably a local term. So this is a tied quilt, and often it says hand-pieced wool and cotton wool bat. And if you tried the quilting, you would know that there's no way you're going to quilt through that. So often they would tie it together to hold the batting in place. And I heard some of the women say too that had about these wool bats, that often if they were junking a quilt or replacing it, they would take the wool out and reuse it because it's wool. It's not going anywhere. This is the corner turned back where it had kind of like a mattress ticking backing on it. Another save-all quilt. This one was done in smaller blocks. 1935. Oops. This is called the string quilt because of the long pieces that were used to make the squares. 1975. Now this quilt, this is, I don't know, this is almost my favorite quilt. It was only a quilt top, it was never quilted, but these are original applique flowers. So this woman designed her own flowers. She may have taken them off of seed packages or whatever, but I just think that's so wonderful that she would design her own flowers for the blocks on this quilt. And the background is the sugar sacks that she's bleached. This is also made from the bleached sugar sacks, and it's an applique quilt as well. Obviously, she didn't have all the same colors of fabrics. This quilt is from 1900, and we're talking about whole cloth quilts. Very few people could afford to have a whole cloth quilt, to buy that yardage. This quilt is quilted on both sides. If you look closely, you can see the binding edge. The back is turned back. So this is the back of the quilt, and this is the front of the quilt. So it's completely quilted on both sides. And I mean, it's of course a lot more work, but she could use her scraps that she had available to her. This is completely made of the feed sack prints. It's kind of like a feed sack sampler. It's interesting to see. And also, as you look at feed sack prints, you start to get a feel for the colors. because sometimes it is a little difficult to tell, is that an actual feed sack? But you can get a feel for the range of colors that were used. Monkey wrench. Obviously, she couldn't get enough of one feed sack to do all the joining, so she had to use blue and gray together. And the back is feed sack print. This is the corner back, turned back again. The same with the Lone Star here, with the feed sacks on the back. And then as we get into the 1890s, towards the turn of the 20th century, we get into crazy quilts in the Victorian era. Usually crazy quilts are done with maybe silk satins, or things from special garments, christening dresses, wedding dresses, that kind of thing. And so you see a lot of luxury fabrics, but I don't think people in Floyd at that time probably were wearing a lot of silks and satins. And so what you see here on this quilt is a crazy quilt of apparel that people were wearing. Here's a square. Like, look at all these plaid shirts, probably. And you have a little tweed in here, herringbone. 1894. So these were similar to save-all quilts, but they were saving pieces of garments usually. This is quite old, 1875. It has a hand-woven cotton back on this quilt. And the woman told me that the arrows and wagons were going west, quote, on a wild goose chase. So it's called Wild Geese. A log cabin from 1930. Another log cabin. This was a really beautiful quilt, I think. Just the combinations of the scrap fabrics and the way that they are dispersed and arranged. And it's interesting, this is fan quilting again. Now probably a quilter today looking at a linear log cabin pattern would probably not think of quilting that in a fan pattern. But it is. This is another quilt that's downstairs. It's interesting because when you look at the actual quilt, it's very obvious that the reds and the blues were hand dyed. They have a big saturation of dye in the fabrics. And another thing that's interesting, it has these little worn spots on it. There's no babbing in this. What is inside is threads that have been raveled and balled up and used for the filling of the quilt. A 1938 quilt from feed sacks. The white fabric is from feed sacks. Here you can see diagonal quilting. Double X. Another. I might say something about the patterns, because a lot of times women would have favorite patterns, or families would have favorite patterns. You'll see a quilt that a mother may have made, and then a daughter may have made that same one. So the patterns were kept and passed down. In the early part of the century, all kinds of magazines, they had another quilting revival, which has kind of come periodically throughout the 20th century. But in 1920, they started to have another quilt revival. And so, like, all the farm journals and all the ladies' magazines had these articles featuring quilts. And it was almost like today, where they would say, oh, here's something from the past that you can replicate, you can do yourself. And so they would clip the patterns from the magazines and make them as well. Rob Peter to pay Paul, I think you can see why. And this was a beautiful quilt too, in its colors. Loose tracks. And very utilitarian with the mattress sticking back. And that's a sample of some Floyd quilts.